Living with questions helps us interrupt the sticky stories that we developed ourselves to keep us safe or surviving. When something catastrophic happens, sometimes we need an answer to keep us from really going off the deep end, to not be clinical there. And those stories sometimes keep us stuck.
You just lost your loved one. Now what? Welcome to the Grief and Life podcast, where we explore this new reality through grief-colored lenses. Openly, authentically, I'm your host, Nina Rodriguez. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the Grief and Life podcast. My name is Nina Rodriguez, and I am your host. What if this summer changed the way that you meet life? That is a question that formed the basis for what Lisa Keefauver and I are calling the Summer Shift series. It's a 3-part series that we co-created. And if you are listening to this on the week that it has been released, then by now we have already completed 2 of the 3 live series. But the conversations have been so rich and meaningful and full of nuggets that I decided to turn this into a podcast episode so that you could watch or listen wherever you're tuning in from, and you can replay it and really absorb all of the wisdom that's being shared there, the conversation, the exchanges, and let us know what resonates. But first, what is the Summer Shift series? This is an idea that Lisa Keefauver and I came up with, and she is the host and author of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. It's a podcast and a book by the same name. She is a grief educator, keynote speaker, all the things. She's amazing. And she does a lot of work with narrative therapy. So about the stories that we tell ourselves. We decided that a 3-part series that builds on a self is the best way. So the first one took place on July 29th, and that was living into the questions. The theme here was curiosity. How do we live into the questions? And this particular episode is a replay of that first conversation. And the second part is shifting our stories. The theme is creativity. The third one is meeting life differently, and the theme is possibility. So the first theme is curiosity, followed by creativity, followed by possibility. The first session was about how we live into the questions. The second one is how we shift our stories. And the third one is how we meet life differently. The second part also took place, and it will be published next week on the Grief and Light podcast. So stay tuned for that. Make sure that you are subscribed so that you can get notified as soon as that's available. And the third session is available on September 9th. If you are listening to this episode or watching this episode before then I highly encourage you to join us. The replay will be available, but if you participate live, then we get to interact in person, and it's a much more enriching conversation. So I hope you can make it. And without further delay, here is the first session of our Summer Shift series, Living into the Questions and Leaning in with Curiosity. Enjoy.
We are so happy to have you all here today. I know folks are going to be joining, or maybe you're watching this later on because we're going to share this with you. My name's Lisa. You might know me as author and podcast host of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm also on Substack at AFGO at Lisa Keefauver, which stands for Another Bleep Growth Opportunity. And I am really passionate about practicing and exploring in the wake of real profound loss in my life, the death of my husband, the death of a friend, my recent survivorship from cancer. How do we use wonder and play to navigate through life's changes? And how do we center aliveness in a world full of loss? And that's one of the many things that brought Nina and I together. And I want Nina to tell you about herself as well.
Absolutely. And I've been so inspired by your work. So thank you for all you do. I want to shout out that I recognize the name here. So hello, Stephen. Welcome. And as you join, also say where you're from and how you relate to your own grief, what brings you here. So I'm the creator and host of Grief and Light. It's a podcast and online platform that focuses on all the things life after loss, how we make meaning and how we foster post-traumatic growth. And basically, how do we get through this thing called life? My personal loss was the one that undid me, if you will. It was the loss of my only sibling, Joseph. That loss, it literally rewrote my life as I knew it. 10 toes down in grief and all the things, wonderment in terms of like, how do we navigate this? How do we live with the questions, which is the main topic that we're going to be covering today. One thing that I want to highlight is that this is a 3-part series that was curated very intentionally by Lisa and myself. And the idea is that each one builds on each other. And I see hello from West Palm Beach, Florida. Hi, Stephen. Good to have you here.
So today we're going to be focusing on curiosity, on living into the questions. What exactly does that mean? And what if you didn't need answers to move forward? Sometimes we think we need closure or something very concrete in order to take the next step. And sometimes we actually don't. So we're going to be exploring that. The second session is going to focus on creativity and shifting our stories. So, how do we shift the stories that became sticky, to use Lisa's words? Like sometimes we assume certain things that happen mean something, and that hinders us from either growth or moving forward or being able to process loss and all the things. And then September 9th, we're going to be focusing on possibilities. So, how do we meet life differently? And with that being said, Lisa, I want to invite you to share a little bit about humans are storytellers. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you so much. And I saw somebody, Chris, one of my subscribers joined. And hi, Chrissy. Shout out to her. She's an incredible artist and intuitive guide. If you don't already know her, check her out. Nina, thanks so much for helping put context to the beginning of this series that we're having. Y'all should know that we've had many of these conversations in a way in our lives offline. This is a passion that both Nina and I share deeply, but we thought it might be interesting to bring to our audiences and maybe invite new audiences. So, one of the things we talked about offline, I would say, is my sort of way of thinking about the importance of how we think of ourselves as storytellers. For those of you that don't know, I am a social worker. I was trained in narrative therapy. I've been practicing that approach to life in my work for the last 20 something years. So, storytelling is really an important idea. And the reason I thought about it in living to the questions was exactly what you said there, Nina, is that we humans crave certainty. We crave an answer, we crave a story, we crave meaning, and meaning is an okay thing to seek. But the challenge is we think that it's always possible when it's not. And so when I say we humans are storytellers, I think it's important for us to understand that we live with what we think is truth with a capital T, is how I talk about it. That there is a truth about our lives, about the world that comes with a capital T. And there isn't, of course, punch, like spoiler alert, there isn't a single answer, a single truth. So living with questions helps us interrupt for all of us some of the sticky stories that have come from other people in the world, that have come from our culture about how we're living, how we're expressing our grief, how we're showing up in the world. Or they might be coming from, if anybody's familiar with parts work, they might be the stories that we developed ourselves to keep us safe or to keep us surviving. When something catastrophic happens, like the death of your brother or the death of your husband, sometimes we need an answer or a true story to keep us from really going off the deep end, to not be clinical there. And those stories sometimes keep us stuck. They keep us from seeing wonder and beauty and delight. They keep us from seeking meaning and purpose. So it's important for us to think about our lives as storytellers. What have we've talked about this before, Nina, but what have you learned about your own relationship to understanding yourself as a storyteller and the power of stories?
Yes, that's something that's actually really present. As you know, I'm in Puerto Rico right now. I live in Florida, so I'm here visiting family and just shed a light on one example. For example, I'm here visiting a family who is receiving hospice care. And there are nothing but questions about what's going to happen next. How are we going to get through this? How is this, what's going to happen? And so, something as simple as not knowing what comes next and being able to be okay with that process is something that is a process. It's a skill in and of itself, but you have to lean into the not knowing and being okay with that. And that's easier said than done. And also in a lot of the conversations I've had with grievers, for example, is especially if somebody experiences sudden loss or traumatic loss, you are literally living with the questions. Why did this happen? Why did it have to be this person? Why did it have to happen this way? So even just on a more like cause and effect way of having to live with these questions, especially after sudden loss, which is the one type of loss that I can relate to, um, we could get stuck in
Yeah.
not being able to process, not being able to be with, being able to keep moving forward in our lives if we just focus on those. And I say just because they feel enormous at that time, especially in early and deep grief. But there is a softening that happens with time and when you lean in. And for example, there are a lot of unanswered questions in the way that my brother's passing happened.
Yeah.
And for a long time, I felt like I needed to have the answers. And the fact that I couldn't get them made me feel very, very stuck. You get stuck in these loops. So how do you interrupt these loops? How do you live a full life without having that anchor you to the moment of loss? How do you release and relinquish that? And I learned that you don't always need the answers, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But how do you shift from that desperation of needing to know to the release, surrender, relinquishing that happens, and you say, you know what, it's okay if I don't know. How do you shift from one thing to another? So thank you for that question. Yeah.
I love that so much. And I think you bring out an important point for those who are listening about living into the questions is for some of you, if you've experienced this sudden loss, all you're doing is living into the questions. Why me? Why them? Why did it happen? How could I have prevented it? So sometimes my invitation for people to live into the questions are first to just get curious about the stories that are keeping you stuck or how the questions that you are asking make you feel, because not all questions result in the same experience in your life. So example, if you're stuck in a question that some people might relate to as a loop, right? Or a rumination, and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere, my invitation would be start to look out for some words that might indicate that even this question is a stuck question. And what would it be like to ask a new question? A new question, if you've been ruminating the why did it happen, might be, how could I live, or what kind of meaning could I find in my life, even if I never got an answer to this question, right? So we're still playing with questions. And I'm going to use the word play today. I use the word play a lot. I don't mean it in a belittling way when we're talking about people in deep grief. I do it very intentionally. I'm pretty intentional with my words. You said before, living into the questions is a process. I would say it's a practice. And so that's where I use that way, play. Anything that we don't have a lot of practice at, we're not going to be good at. And for a lot of us, we live in a culture that teaches us to be expert. And anything where you don't have an answer is somehow a failure. We also are neurobiologically wired for familiarity and an answer because that's kept us kind of in a survival state. So I would say playing with the practice and playing with questions is also about being curious about the questions that are guiding your life right now, and how are asking those questions making you feel, or in relationship to your grief, to your life, in relationship to hope, to the relationships that you have in your life. We talked before, and I wanted to point out a couple of words to help folks identify when they might be in stuck stories, and this might be a time for to include like living into the questions and inviting questions into your daily practice of life. And there's many words, but I sort of drilled them down to 5. I talked about it in my book, In Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, but I also wrote an essay here on Substack last year, I want to say. I think it was called something like 5 words that are making you think you're stuck in your grief. And those words are should and shouldn't. I call it shoulding all over yourselves. They're always, never, and but.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but in my own life, in my own seasons of hardship, transition, survivorship, but also, of course, in the work that I do with individual grievers, I am now trained, because I've been in narrative practice for 20 years, to listen out to those words. And when you start deciding to play with and pay attention to those words, pretty surprising how often they're showing up in relationship to the thing that you're struggling with most. Have you found that in your own kind of grief process or in the work that you do with folks?
Absolutely. And it's one of my favorite chapters in your book because it was the one that unlocked like things don't have to be anything other than what they are. And when you have, or when I had that moment of things just are, and they may not be what I want them to be. They're certainly not what I want them to be after loss. But um, this is where I realized, we have a certain amount of agency if we just let go of the strict definitions, the strict grip on these types of words that you said, which is should, shouldn't, always, never, and but, these absolutes. There really is nothing, like you said, no capital T truth in life. And that extends to these types of words. And so, to give it a little bit more context, there's a difference between the pain that is the static element, like you experience a lot, the person is gone. Your person, your beloved, is no longer physically with us. There's nothing you can do about that. Then there's the suffering, which is the part that is dynamic, where we have agency, where we have some sort of control, if you will. And the 5 words that you talk about, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong if you see it differently, but I believe live in this area where that is more dynamic, where we have more agency. And sometimes the way to navigate through is so simple that we miss it. How could it be that simple of just not shitting on ourselves, like not using these words and maybe replacing them for something else. And it's like you said, it's a practice. I love that you say that. It's not a process, it's a practice. So just noticing the times, whenever you do, noticing the times when you say it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be so hard. These things always happen to me. I will never be happy again. So when we say these big statements that maybe in the moment feel accurate, but is that even true, right? Because the only constant in life is change. And so even when it feels, what's that saying, like in the bad times this too shall pass, in the good times this too shall pass. So just understanding that when things are good, enjoy it while it lasts, because it is going to change. And when things are not great, understand that it's also going to change. And a lot of this is where I absolutely love that chapter. So maybe let me ask you, like, let me ask the people who are here, and everybody, welcome. David, I just see you joined. So 2 things. What type of grief are you connecting to? What type of questions are you living with, if you will? So for example, if you lost somebody, what questions were you left with after their passing? Maybe share that. And if it's a non-death related loss, because there's grief in, like, divorce, job loss, big major life changes, what questions, what uncertainties are you living with right now? So that's posed for everybody joining us now and even later if you're watching this later. And yeah, just sending it back to you in terms of, like, give us a little bit more context or example, something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you naming kind of how that's showing up, how these words, how we're stuck stories and showing up. And I think this is where curiosity, when I think about living into the question, sometimes it is a literal question. And we're going to probably talk about today um, learning to spend time with a question over a period of time, like living with a question, meaning, and I'm working on a little project to make some cards to help folks live with the questions. But it's also just about having a curious approach to your own life. Some people in other therapeutic modalities might call it being your observer self, sort of like noticing how you're thinking or talking to yourself or about your experience of grief. So when I say playing with or practicing living with a question, sometimes it's not forming a specific question. It's more about the approach of being curious. So it's about being what I call a should detective, maybe taking a day or a week or a month to try to track and notice every time you're saying should or shouldn't when it comes to whatever pain or experience that you're struggling with. Um, you're going to start noticing the way you might often say always or never. And I would challenge you to convince me that that's ever true, right? That there's always exceptions. And why is that important? Well, if we say something like, I'm always going to feel this way, or I'm never going to stop crying, then we are limiting ourselves from seeing a possible version of our lives that could be, or what are the steps that we might take starting close in, to quote David White, to do that. So you might think, oh, Lisa's wordsmithing, but I think these words have power, right? Another way to play into it, but is the biggest one. Every clinical student I've ever had, every client I've ever had, my now grown daughter, my friends, everybody knows when I hear them say but, I always offer, and I said always there because pretty much always, I
It
always
applies this time. Yeah.
applies this time. I most often, here I'll correct myself, invite people to say and, because both things can be true. If you say but, then you are debunking anything that came before. Oh, actually, I've been having easier days, but dun, 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 the hard thing, then you're not allowing yourself to see what's possible. Another little trick I invite people to play when they're being curious to how they're talking to themselves, how they might live with more questions in their lives, is adding for now.
Yes.
Adding for now at the any end of any statement as a way to play with that. You know, you and I share this love of poetry. We both had poet Rosemary Vitola Trauma on our show. I write poetry. I believe you do too. My bookshelf is stacked with poets. But I wanted to share, as we're talking about this theme of the power of words and thinking about that in relationship to the questions. Of course, you know, if you know anything about living into the questions, we will be talking about Rainier Maria Rilke soon. But I don't know if you know the poet Gregory Orr, but he wrote this poem called "Let's Remake the World with Words." It's very short, but I think it's um, a beautiful invitation for all of us to think about the ways in which we talk to ourselves or about ourselves in times of change or transition or grief or loss. He invited us, let's remake the world with words, not not frivolously, nor to hide from what we fear, but with a purpose. As Wordsworth said, remove the dust of custom so things shine again, each object arrayed in its robe of original light. And then we'll see the world as if for the first time, as once we gazed at the beloved who was gazing at us.
That's beautiful.
Remaking the world, and it made me think of what you said earlier, a profound change in our life, a death loss, a job loss, infertility, all kinds of family disruption, uh, immigration, loss of culture. These things have a way of remaking us. They remake our sense of ourselves, our position in the world. And that comes with, and I think that's part of what we're hoping to come out in this series. It's, of course, that comes with deep grief, like loss of identity, loss of self, I've experienced traumas. Many people watching might have too, loss of sense of safety. And if we can live into the questions, we might get curious and someday along the way, as Maria Rilke says, stumble into the answer of what did that remaking also allow us to see differently or experience differently in the world? I'm certainly someone who lives so much more present to delight and wonder and awe than I ever did. And that happens even more each time I go through a threshold of some hard thing. So yeah, remaking the world with words is also is a play on what we're talking about here. Does that resonate for you, Nina? Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that one. I was not familiar with that poem.
Mhm.
I going back to what you said about not adding that
For now.
yet at the end,
Yeah.
right? So just adding that sense of possibility, not being so absolute about what happened and what could happen, right? I saw a quote the other day that said, like, museums are testaments to all the grief and sorrow that people had endured and the answers they tried to figure out. So the way that they lived into the questions, if you will, the way that they proposed a way forward or an answer or another question to whatever it is that they experienced. And I find it so fascinating because we don't we don't necessarily need to be concrete about the things in life that, quite frankly, sometimes don't even have an explanation, right? From why does this happen? One thing that I hear often is like, why do bad things happen to good people? Which is a layered statement, one that I always reframe because I don't believe that's the case. But just why do these things happen? How do we move forward? How is this possible? Like what all these questions, and yet we figure out a way forward. We figure it out. We find a way, if you will.
Yeah.
And one of the best ways that we share this in common is through poetry, through writing, through what I call like the clues that somebody else left, the breadcrumbs that somebody else left for us. Music, art, all the things. And that's part of the expression. So I'm curious for those joining here. Is there a poem that has unlocked something for you? Is there a song? Is there a quote
Yeah.
or a statement or something that somebody said to you that resonated, right? So, for example, somebody said to me in early grief, which at the time it didn't click, but it was one of those like, I'll put this in my back pocket and I'll revisit later. It was, you have to become an active participant in your life. That sounded harsh to me at first, if I'm very honest. I was like, oh, that was rude. But then with time, again, something softened and I said, I wonder what that would look like. What does that mean? If I were to give that meaning, what does that mean? And again, that's a question that opened up the door to say, I get to define what's next, even in the context of loss, but I get to live what I call a get to live life. I get to live this life. What do I want to make of it? Even with all of the loss, even, despite everything that's happened. So I really love that. And I also share the passion for Rilke's writing because it's such a beautiful invitation, like you said, to live with the questions.
Yeah, I love the not get to, not have to reframe,
Yeah.
and the agency that we can take in our lives. And if you're in early grief, by the way, this is not, and everything happens for a reason, bull. You will never hear those words coming out from my mouth. This is not that. That it says this horrible thing happened, and
And
what and pause. What can you do? And some days that's crying on your couch or being in the fetal position, or, this is not about marching and productivity. In fact, this is the anti productivity. This is about settling in with curiosity. And part of what I see, I experience, I invite in with the people I work through my writing, through my show, is to begin to notice ways in which reframing things, like instead of saying I have to, say I get to. Sometimes I use "I get to" with sarcasm, by the way, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I get to do laundry. But another way to do it is "I get to" is this reminder of these profound losses that we experience can be an invitation for us to reconnect with the preciousness of life, the brevity of this time that we have here, the uncertainty, and allow uncertainty instead of to drown us, but to inspire us. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about it. Rilke's quote, he said, I quoted it in my book, and I just wanted to name, you touched on this earlier, but I wanted to name before I kind of read the fuller quote, is that if living into the questions feels hard to you, if you're a person who's like reframing and revisiting the same stories over and over again, these stuck stories, identity stories, they often sound like I'm always, I never, I should. They're usually negative stories. I don't have value. I'm not worthy. I'm not deserving. These kinds of stories. A lot of survivor guilt, people experiencing survivor's guilt, is as I said, we're a culture that loves certainty. We reward expertise and knowing. So if living into the questions feels awkward or clumsy or risky or scary, I see you. Of course it does. How could it be any other way? As my meditation teacher used to say to me, of course it is, sweetie. How could it be any other way? Because back to what we were saying before, we don't have, many of us, not all of us,
Right.
many of us don't have a lot of practice. And that's why this series, the work that I'm doing, the work that you're doing, is really about helping us develop skills and invitations to practice living with the questions. Part of what he wrote in his book, Letters to a Young Poet, most of you will be familiar with this. He said, and the point is to live everything, live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
appreciate that there's that some distant day, right? Because the answer, if it comes at all, doesn't have to happen right away. We also live in a context of like an instant gratification, you know,
We have to
20
Google it right away, so we have
Google
the
it,
answer.
AI, 30 seconds, if that 10-second attention span, whatever. But it's just that trusting that whatever needs to unfold will as it needs to. And with time, maybe that I'm going to call it desperation because that's the word I could relate to, especially during early grief. It's like, I need to know, I need to know, I need to know. That softens, that loosens, or that can loosen its grip. And it takes time. And 7 years later, I can also honestly say I no longer ask the same questions. There is no desperation on that end. And if anything, it's leading with wonderment and that possibility of
Yeah.
not seeking the answers now and just trusting whatever is going to unfold.
I love that so much, Nina, because you named something there that I wanted to make sure that we talked about today, which is the interesting thing about living into the questions and not rushing towards an answer is that often what happens over time is the questions that we were once asking no longer hold purchase in our imagination. We have new experiences, we come upon new insights, we discover a way of seeing the world differently, such
Yes.
that those answers don't hold the same kind of like resonance or pull on us. And you can't plan for that. You can't talk your way out of it if you're stuck in a question that feels like stuck in a loop. No, but we're going to practice our way by living into that. And at some point, beginning to play around with, again, I'm using that word play. I know that's
Yes.
hard for some folks, but beginning to play around with questions that invite us to the and. Could I be in somebody who's in grief, who will carry grief with me? Because that's what we do. We don't move on from it. We learn to build the musculature to carry it with us. Can I be somebody? This might be a different question. I remember asking, how can I raise our daughter? My daughter was 7 when my husband died. I was 40 years old. And I remember thinking, how can I ever raise my daughter? How could I ever be a parent? So later on, what the question is, yeah, maybe is I'm not going to be the parent that I was when I had a partner, when her dad was alive.
Right.
And what if it's possible that I can offer her a differently beautiful life? That became a different question. Sometimes we don't have them that articulate in our mind, but that was sort of the shifting background question. And that's that approach to what you're talking about. And really what the series in a way is about is how do we use the agency that we have, use our way with words, use our curiosity and our questions to begin to move into a space of wonderment and play and delight, because to have one without the other feels, again, back to the get to, like life is so precious. It feels that my invitation is, wouldn't it be a waste to not be present to the both of it? Because the truth is life gonna be lifing, as the kids say.
Right.
So we're gonna have them both. But most of us have the practice or the musculature to be on the lookout for the hard thing, the bad thing, the devastating thing, especially if you've been through trauma or profound loss. You're like expert skilled at that. And I'm speaking for myself. I am expert skilled at that. So this practice, this series, this work that I'm focusing on, and I think you're focusing on too, is how can we still allow that to be valid and
Right.
human, and how can we build the skills to also be present to the beauty outside our door, the sweetness of the kindness of our neighbor, the awe of you know, natural wonder, etc. Which reminds me sort of the, I know we've talked before about my penchant and love for Jack Gilbert's poem A Brief for the Defense. You know the one I'm talking about?
I think so, but I
Yeah.
wanted to, yes, before that, I wanted to highlight something that you mentioned fun. You say, I'm going to play with this. I'm going to,
Yes.
and yes, we're using that term with nuance with the conversation that we're having. But even if we hold the nuance, I do invite people to really play in the sense of don't allow everything to be so heavy. Life after loss is heavy enough, right? There is so much from paperwork to arrangements to all the things that are already just dense things to get through life, dense life experiences. It is okay, even then, and when you feel ready, to invite play and fun. And I'm not saying you need to make everything a grandiose adventure and you need to be like, laughing hysterically, even though that's okay too. It's more, how can you invite lightness into your life, even after everything that's happened, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
question at the beginning of my podcast, the introduction, is you just lost a loved one. Now what? Because that question resonated, it just echoed in my mind. It reverberated through my being after my loss, after my family's loss. I said, we have never known this version of our lives. We were not expecting to get to know this version of ourselves in in each other's lives, who we are to each other, who
Mhm.
we are to ourselves, how are we showing up in the world from now on? And it's so tempting to want to define all of that right after trauma, catastrophe, all the things. But as much as loss takes away, it also creates space, wanted or unwanted, for us to dream up what now, what next. And the to-dos that come with loss will always be there. There's things you have to get through. That's fine. We get through those. And then what do you get to do with this? Another poet, Mary Oliver, like
One wild and
wild,
precious life.
one wild and precious life,
Yeah.
and you don't have to answer that right away, but it is an invitation to open the door, to let some light in and to think in terms of possibility. Loss takes so much. it also leaves room for so much possibility. So I wanted to touch on that. I also wanted to welcome, I saw Judith join us, and everybody that's here today. Again, we would love to know what type of grief brings you here, what type of loss, what is your connection to this topic, if you will. I want to keep it pretty broad and invite you to do that. And yes, for Jack Gilbert's poem, I would love for you to read some of that. And
Well, I love what you just said, and that your question, Grief and Light, we've both had the privilege of being on each other's podcast, so you can check that out if you want to. But I love this now what question because I don't think I've ever met anybody going through any loss, change, transition in their life that hasn't asked that question once, if not every 5 minutes for months at a time in early loss. And that's an appropriate question to ask in the midst of early change. And that's one where if you can practice noticing that the question is there and not having a story of judgment that you don't have the answer. I think the trick is where we get stuck is when we have a kind of internal expectation that we need an answer and that there's a total answer, a singular answer. Another poet, of course, I love and I quote all the time is David White, and his poems start close in. So my answer always, what became a practice for me, a little game that I played with myself when I found myself in the now what, I just went through this again, navigating breast cancer treatment these last few years, is now what? And then my answer is next, start close in. Can I breathe? Have I moved? Have I slept? Have I reached out to a friend? Right? So we can play with that. So that theme, though, is also to what you were just talking about, is also opening up to the possibility, to the wonderment, to the get to in life. And a couple of years ago, just after the publication of my book and finishing my active breast cancer treatment, I was, as you I think know, Nina, but others might know, had the chance to speak at Endwell. And I gave this talk called Centering Aliveness in a
one
World.
of my absolute favorites. I literally took notes on that. It was so, so good. It really just shifted so much.
Thank you so much. So, centering aliveness in a world full of loss is really the focus of my work moving forward, which of course includes grief, but it's really about what we're talking about in the summer series. And we hope you'll join us for the next two events that we're having. And I imagine this will be the beginning of many collaborations that we do together. But this is this idea of how do we hold the both and, right? How do we carry this both? And in that talk, I quoted Jack Gilbert. He has this gorgeous, devastating, beautiful, again, very both and poem called A Brief for the Defense. And he said in part in this poem, we must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world.
Can you say that one more time? It was so good.
Yeah, it's so good. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world.
Wow.
And what I went on to say, I wanted to share because I think it kind of ties into the theme of what we've been talking about today. I invited the audience, and I'm inviting you here listening live, and if you're watching this later on, that if we don't allow delight to dazzle our senses, if amazement doesn't make us breathless from time to time, if the story we tell ourselves and one another only includes the hardness and depravity of this world, then we lose twice. Right?
And I would love to invite you. I like reading it a second time just because there's so much there. If you don't mind, just a second time.
Yeah, of course. If we don't allow delight to dazzle our senses, if amazement doesn't make us breathless from time to time, if the only story we tell ourselves and one another includes the hardness and depravity of this world, then we lose twice.
That's so powerful. And I would love to know when you wrote that,
Yeah.
can you, if it's okay with you, can you take us back to that version of you that
Yeah.
was able to channel that duality in that moment and that understanding of it's this and that, it's both?
Yeah. It came, I had read Jack Gilbert's poem. I don't even remember when I first stumbled upon it, but
Well,
long before I decided to write this talk, before Endwell invited me to give this talk. But again, positioning me. So I was, maybe 10 something years out from losing my husband, but I was literally, May of 2024, I got my port removed from my cancer treatment surgery. June 4th, 2024, my book published, and I went on a book tour. And then August, I started writing this talk for the November Endwell event. So this was really in a crux of time of transition. I barely had any hair. I was physically, obviously, very devastated from the chemo and radiation and all the things. So definitely could have been in a place in my life where I was very much F everything and it's all hard. But it was so clear to me that like, this is an insane thing that is happening. Both in the span of those 2 years, I had two dreams come true. I gave a TEDx talk, which happened 1 month after I received my diagnosis, and I published my first book. And I navigated devastating breast cancer, which had been misdiagnosed, which reminded me of the misdiagnosis that my husband went through. So I was literally living the most, not the most, but a both and the highest highs and the lowest lows. I think actually that year, that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once came
Yes,
out.
yes.
And I think I wrote a piece about that. Like, I'm having one of my Everything Everywhere All at Once seasons of my life. And so when Endwell asked me to talk, I knew I didn't want to give the talk that I gave at TEDx, which is why knowing more about grief can make it suck less. I didn't want it to be about grief. I was wanting to write about what I was living and playing with and practicing, which was how do I center aliveness in a world full of loss? How do I live with these both ands? And that particular stanza, though the whole poem is again beautifully devastating and profound, really sung to me. And so I was very centered on this idea of how was I walking the walk in my daily life? And so that talk explores some of the strategies that I was using. But behind those strategies, which I didn't share in the talk, are some of the questions that we've been talking about offline that I want to make sure that we share with folks inland
Yes.
of like, how do I allow myself to be an experiencer of hard things while practicing and cultivating the musculature that it takes. And I want to shout out Dr. Joe Cacciatore, who I think first introduced me to that idea of the word musculature when we're thinking about grief. Because to me, playing with questions, living into the questions, the themes of creativity and curiosity that we're going to be exploring in this series is about this reminder that the same musculature that it takes us to be with the hard feelings, to be present, to turn towards our grief, to turn towards our sorrow, is the same that allows us to turn towards delight and wonder and awe. And actually, the more we can learn to turn towards delight and wonder and awe or play, however you want to think about it, the more it's a balm to the weight of grief. It allows us to move with flexibility between the both and, because as we've said in this conversation, life is going to be full of many of these things. So we're living with that of those. So that's kind of the story of how that talk came to be, and it was really rooted in my own lived experience. And of course, because I serve clients, I'm always have the privilege and opportunity to be listening to other people's stories. And as a podcast host, I listen to other people's stories of the both and of their lives too. So I really drew on the fact that I know for a fact that it takes practice, but that it's really possible. And that it is allowing me to experience a kind of life after loss I never would have imagined.
Yes.
And probably, honestly, if you had told me this year one, year two, I would have used one of my favorite swear words at you, which I won't again on this live, even though I love to do that, to do that. And that's what it's allowed me to do. I see somebody has made a comment. I don't know if I can read the whole thing here, but I want to make sure we're
Sure, I
inviting our.
could read it here.
Yeah.
It says, it's from David. Thank you, David. Some interesting themes. I can see and understand the positivity of looking for joy in dealing with grief. But first, quote, we must embrace pain and burn it as fuel for our journey, unquote. Or to put it in another way, the children's book, Going on a Bear Hunt, we can't go over it, we can't go under it, we have to go through it. For where I am personally is later in the grief, but it still bubbles up periodically. Thank you, David, for that comment.
Thank you, David.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And this way of thinking of centering aliveness in the world full of loss, this practice of living into the questions will take different forms. Hi, Barry. Thanks for joining. Will take different forms depending on where you are in your grief.
Right.
And the beauty of this practice of living into the questions is that it's, again, I think one of the things Dave was just pointing to there is sometimes we have a tendency to try to bypass. We try to toxic positivity our way into the world. And that is the exact opposite of this practice that we're talking about playing and practicing and living with the questions. It's about allowing ourselves to vacillate. There may be seasons in your grief where you're really in the going through it part. And your only question that you're playing with is like, what now?
Yep.
Or now what? And you're saying start close in. And that might be what you're playing with. As time goes on, as you've learned and built the musculature to be with the hard feeling, to carry the weight of your grief, then you might be able to be playing with questions in a different way that might begin to allow you to notice not even just seeking joy, but actually just give yourself permission to be present to and joy might be too big of a word. Give
Right.
yourself permission to be present to the delight that's already happening in your daily life.
Yeah.
Does that resonate for you too? Yeah.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of someone we both admire, which is Rosemary Watola Tromer. She's also a poet. And I remember she writes a poem a day for the last, I believe it's 20 years. So she has written a poem a day, which is, yes, the sheer number. For
Our friend
20.
and poet Sarah Ryan just joined us, so she
Hi,
knows what a
Sarah.
big deal this is.
Yes. And so one thing that stuck out to me, and part of the greater umbrella theme of this conversation, this initial conversation, is actually to build the practice in the first place, right? So one thing that I learned from Rosemary is that she said, I had this practice before I experienced my loss.
Yes.
And that practice is what became a anchor, her center, her lifeline through her loss and to this day, obviously. So a lot of this is not necessarily like break in case of emergency, only do it when things are bad. If anything, it's more, how can we build this practice? How can, as Lisa says, center aliveness in a world full of loss when we are feeling joyful, when we are feeling grief, when we are going through the hard times, when we are going through the good times. It's at all times. How can we build this into a practice that centers us, that brings us back home to ourselves, that leaves the door open for wonderment, that helps us navigate this thing called life in the quote unquote like good times and bad times.
Yeah.
And so because you mentioned about, toxic positivity and everything. So we just have to be careful that this is not just, hey, you're feeling sad, try to lean into a question. Although that's fine too. But, that's not the point of this practice and this conversation and this overarching theme of like just leading life in general with curiosity and embracing the questions that way. Would you agree with that?
I definitely do. And I think, I love that you brought up Rosemary. She's just a gorgeous poet, as is our friend Sarah, who has joined, a gorgeous poet. Is that it's just like you can't, if you're going to go hike, the Himalayan mountains, you're not going to just the day before start trying to hike, right? So this idea of practicing living with the questions, the fact that she had leaned on writing poetry as a practice, even in good times or times that were more full of ease, was that she had the kind of muscle memory, the musculature, the kind of instinct. And that's why I think this practice is really helpful. I think about living into the questions. You can do it in lower stakes times. I find them really useful to live into if you find yourself in a stuck place, and how each of us define being in a stuck place. I call that sticky stories. In fact, I'm doing a in-person in San Diego writing workshop on that and an online workshop in September. The sticky stories, it might be around a relationship. It might be around job career shift. It might be around your life after loss, for sure. It might be around something heavy. But a time to practice playing with questions more earnestly would be if you notice that you're in a sticky loop. You're revisiting the same question, you hear yourself telling the same story. If you told every single friend in your life 5 times over the same narrative about a sticky situation in your life or a way that you're feeling, I mean, guilty.
Right. Me too.
Been there, done that, still will do that. Those are the times where we might begin to play with questions. And you and I had talked about some questions that we thought maybe we would offer up the folks who are joining us on the Substack
Yes.
Live. Yeah.
But if I may, I took your sticky stories course and it really helped unlock quite a bit for me. And one analogy, if you could just briefly mention it, that you offered is the constellation. I don't know if if you want to save that for later or if you're willing to share a little bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, that's right. I did a multi-part series last year, I think, on sticky stories.
And Sarah says guilty as well. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Happened to
Thank
all of
you.
us.
But you know what? That's human. Whenever I find somebody confessing to something like around this, it's like, welcome to being part of the human community. This is what we do. So the constellation is a metaphor. If you know me, you know I love everything metaphor. Duh. Metaphor helps us get at the complexities of life that straightforward language doesn't. Truth told slant, I think somebody once said. But the constellation's a metaphor I learned, I don't know, decades ago when I was training in narrative therapy. And I don't know who said it originally. I really wish I don't think I came up with this on my own, but it's been now
We'll
in my
search for
mind
it later. Yeah.
since 2002, is that when we look up at the night sky, when we were young, we were taught to look for the Little Dipper, the Big Dipper, Orion's Belt. So we look up into the night sky and we can see those things immediately. And in fact, that's really all we start to see. So we've developed a story that the sky is these three constellations. When we play with questions, when we allow ourselves to be curious, when some life event happens that kind of shifts our world, we might look up at the night sky and zoom out and then be able to notice different stars and different constellations that we might draw a new story that tells us something new. So for many of us, the metaphor of Little Dipper, Big Dipper, Orion's Belt is some stuck story we've told ourselves over time. I'm not good at math. I'm a bad sister. I'm not a good writer. I shouldn't have, I should have. We have kind of these stories. You know the stories, y'all.
Yeah.
We all have the stories, right? And part of this curiosity and living with the questions when we're having sticky stories, I'd like to invite people to think about you're going to look up at the night sky. You can do this physically, by the way, or just metaphorically. And you're going to notice those stories right away or those beautiful, those constellations. And I want to invite you to zoom out and begin to look for the other stars, which might be other experiences in your life that actually offer you an alternative or what they call in narrative therapy, an exception story that might start to draw some new story. Actually, I'm somebody who is capable of change because of X, Y, and Z transformation. And we begin to draw new constellations, which gives us a new perspective or way of living. So that's the constellation metaphor.
I absolutely loved it. And one thing that stuck out is that you're not looking for new stars that just popped up. It's the same ones that have always been there. So it's like, what else is here, right? Besides Orion's belt, if you will, what else is here? And what else can I notice? And what new patterns can I draw? And that really just unlocks so much because it's like, gosh, we are so accustomed to our routines and to our way of thinking and to even some phrases that might seem harmless, but at the end of the day they're beliefs. Like one that comes to mind, it's like money doesn't grow on trees. Well, that's it's something so quote unquote like harmless. There's a lot underneath there. So what have you repeated to yourself? What have you believed for a very long time that has become a sort of Orion's belt, if you will, in your life? And what else is there? What is behind that? What else can we lean into? So with that, yeah, I just wanted to make sure because I love that analogy. And yes, for some of the questions that we wanted to leave. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Jackie. Hi, Jackie. Yeah, you brought up something. Yeah, it's just so powerful. Is that constellations metaphor is important because it's not about what future thing you could be. It's actually looking for evidence of the skills, the capacities, the agency that you've already exhibited. Yes, maybe in different scenarios in your life. So it's actually drawing deep into your capacity about what you already have, what you're already capable. An alternative truth story. We started our first at the beginning here talking about there's no such thing as truth with a capital T. Those stories that are harmful stories or stuck stories become so true that we can't see other stories. And these practices, living with the questions, allows us begin to find more helpful stories. So one of the questions that I have, and I'm working on a little product for you. I probably will share after
Stay
our
tuned. Stay
and our
tuned.
third which is what stories am I holding on to? This is kind of a four-part question, but it's really one question. What stories am I holding on to? Are they mine? Are they kind? Are they helpful? That causes us to recognize that we're you're always paying attention to something. this curiosity invites you to think, what are you paying attention to? And when you ask that series of questions, what stories am I holding on to? Are they kind? Are they helpful? Are they mine? Gives us maybe space to go looking for the evidence of other stories, the stories that make us feel like we're capable, we have capacity, that we know how to navigate these hard seasons. Another question, I'm going to throw a surprise for you. It wasn't
Please
even
go ahead.
one that I put on this. I shared
On the
some
spot.
questions with Nina ahead of time, but I think it's a really important question. It was one of the zingy ones where I was doing my art project that I'm going to be teasing you guys about these cards that really was zingy for me, which is, what do you already know? So often in times of overwhelm and grief, we're searching for answers and like there's some solution out there.
Yeah.
But part of what we can gain when we pause and sit with, what do I already know to be true? And that's about the kind of, what do I know about myself as a survivor, as somebody who knows how to be with my feelings? I know that walking and beauty and nature helps me. I know that poetry serves me. So starting also with a question of, when you're feeling stuck,
Yeah.
about a place of uncertainty in your life, asking yourself, what do I already know, is a really powerful question.
It
Yeah.
truly is. And it took me a second to just think about it, but I remembered uh, nature, just being in nature. Whenever things get overwhelming, I feel like nature is the force with the capacity to hold the magnitude of, grief, loss, and life's biggest experiences. And so when we feel like there's nothing that can hold us, I know that nature can. And I know that in being outdoors or commuting in whatever way is accessible at the time is really important. The other thing is like slowing down.
Yeah.
You know, whenever life gets really overwhelming, we tend to want to say, okay, I have to do more. I have to, just
Less.
offload, slow
less.
down, and do less. And that feels true to me. So that's a beautiful question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I know we're getting towards the end of our time together this time. I know Nina's going to share when our next two events are, but I'm curious if there are other questions that we've talked about that feel particularly helpful to you or present to you, or other questions you're playing with, either from the things that we've shared or just questions that you've been playing with in your own life.
I know Sarah plays with a lot of questions.
I know she does,
It's amazing. Yeah. And as you think of any questions that may come up, we'll read them if somebody types them. But we want to invite you again. This is a 3-part series. This is the first of 3. And the idea is that we take the summer to lean into the questions. So between now and August 12th, we invite you to see what questions show up for you. What can you lean into this season? How can you live into your own life's questions? And then the third one will be on September 9th, and that one will focus on possibility. So we're focusing today on curiosity, on the questions. Next will be creativity, and then it will be possibility. Thank you, Sarah. Love it too.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much. And when we save this and share it on our Substacks, I'll go in and try to list some of the questions that we didn't get to today that you might want to play with between now and our next series. Think about playing with some questions, and you can bring that to our conversation on August 12th. Nina, thanks for being in this series with me. Thank you all for joining us today in this summer series that we're having. Today's theme of living into the questions. I hope you take some time and start incorporating playing with the questions in your lives.
Absolutely. And thank you for this idea. Thank you, Barry, for your comment. Thank you, Stephen. He says both this was great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
That's it for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Grief and Light podcast. I'd also love to connect with you and hear your thoughts and your stories. Feel free to share them with me via my Instagram page at Grief and Light, or you can also visit griefandlight.com for more information and updates. Thank you so much for being here, for being you, and always remember, you are not alone.